The night in Castilla La Mancha was unusually still, with only the faint rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of crickets breaking the silence. The full moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow across the quiet village. The air felt cool, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones. But there was something else, something heavier, as though the night itself was holding its breath. The village was small, tucked away in the Spanish countryside, surrounded by ancient forests that seemed to stretch endlessly. The woods just outside the village had always intrigued me. Despite the peaceful charm of the place, the locals often spoke in hushed tones about these woods. They warned of strange happenings, of voices carried on the wind, and of eyes watching from the shadows. I had heard the stories before, stories that I dismissed as just folklore, but there was something about them that tugged at my curiosity. It was a night much like any other when I decided to venture into the woods. The villagers had gathered at a square, speaking in low voices, but their words were only half listened to. I couldn't stop thinking about the stories about people who wandered into those woods, only to come back changed, or not come back at all. Some of them spoke of hearing whispers at night, faint and distant, calling out to anyone who would listen. Others claimed to have seen shadows moving between the trees, always just out of sight, like something waiting. The more I heard, the more intrigued I became. I had to see it for myself. I grabbed my jacket and set off toward the edge of the village. The path to the woods was narrow, lined with old stone walls that were covered in moss, as if they had been standing for centuries. As I walked, the air seemed to thicken, and the night felt deeper. The familiar sounds of the village faded away, replaced by the soft creaking of the trees swaying in the wind. The moonlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy of leaves above, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the ground. It was then that I first noticed the silence. The usual hum of nature was gone. No birds, no insects, nothing but the soft thudding of my own heartbeat. I continued walking, my feet crunching on the dried leaves beneath me. The deeper I went into the woods, the more the silence pressed in around me, like a thick fog that suffocated the air. It was as if the woods themselves were holding some ancient secret, a secret that no one was supposed to know. The further I ventured, the more the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The path grew darker, the shadows heavier, and for a moment I felt like I was being swallowed by the forest. Then, just as I was starting to second-guess my decision, I heard it. A voice. At first, it was nothing more than a faint whisper, like the wind rustling through the leaves. I paused, straining my ears, trying to make out the words. But there were no words, just a soft murmuring, as if someone was speaking from a distance. The sound seemed to be coming from deeper within the woods, beckoning me further in. My heart began to race. I had heard the stories, of course, but hearing it for myself was something entirely different. I told myself it was just the wind, just my imagination running wild. But something in the air, something in the very atmosphere, told me otherwise. I took a step forward, my feet light but unsure. The voice grew slightly louder, and I could just make out a single word, something that sounded like my name. At first, I couldn't believe it. My name? How could anyone know my name out here in the woods, where no one lived for miles? I froze, unsure of whether I should keep going or turn back. The wind whispered again, but this time the voice was clearer. It called me, softly, but with an urgency that made my heart skip a beat. I tried to brush it off. I turned around, ready to head back to the safety of the village. But as I did, something caught my eye. A figure. It was just a flash, a dark shape darting between the trees. My breath caught in my throat as I spun around, my eyes searching the darkness for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. The forest was still, unnervingly still. My pulse quickened. Was it a person? A shadow? Or was it something else entirely? I took a deep breath, forcing myself to remain calm. It had to be the wind, the play of shadows, or maybe even a trick of the moonlight. Yet, the feeling in my chest, the gnawing sense of dread, refused to go away. The voice, the shape in the trees, and the unshakable feeling of being watched. I felt the urge to leave, to run back to the village where things made sense. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something important was waiting for me out there, just beyond the shadows. I stepped forward, cautiously this time, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The air was thick, oppressive, as if something was hanging just beyond my reach, just out of sight, waiting for me to discover it. The whisper came again, this time louder, almost a hiss, as if the wind itself was trying to tell me something. I tried to ignore it, to push the fear aside, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. Each step felt heavier, as if the forest was trying to pull me deeper into its dark embrace. But despite the fear, I couldn't turn away. I had to know what lay in the heart of those woods, what had been buried for so long. And that was the moment when I saw it again, a shadow flickering just beyond the trees, moving as if it had a life of its own. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood frozen, the voice growing louder in my ears. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a call, a summons from the depths of the forest, drawing me in. I had come too far to turn back now. Whatever this was, whatever dark force called to me from the shadows, I was going to find out what it wanted. The village was as quiet as ever when I returned, the stillness of the night still hanging in the air, like an unspoken promise. It was hard to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled in my chest. The woods, the whispers, and the shadow I'd seen, it all felt like more than just folklore. I couldn't shake the need to know more, to dig deeper into the mystery that seemed to cling to the very ground I walked on. But there was a problem. As soon as I started asking around about the woods, the atmosphere in the village shifted.
At first, it seemed harmless enough. I casually brought up the topic in the village square, chatting with a few locals who were sitting outside their homes, enjoying the cool evening air. But the moment I mentioned the whispers, the mood changed. People stopped talking, their eyes darting around as if they could feel something lurking just beyond their sight. It wasn't just the stories that made them uncomfortable. It was the way they reacted. Like the mere mention of the woods opened a door to something they weren't ready to face. I tried again, this time speaking to an older woman who had been sweeping the front porch of her house. She looked at me, her eyes hard and knowing. When I asked about the woods, she stiffened, her movements becoming more rigid. She didn't answer immediately, but after a long pause, she spoke in a low, cautious tone.
"The woods are not to be trifled with," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're better off forgetting about them. Let the past stay where it belongs." It was clear she wasn't going to say any more, so I moved on to someone else, a man sitting outside the tavern. He was older, his hands rough from years of labor, and his face lined with the wrinkles of a life well lived. When I mentioned the whispers in the woods, his reaction was immediate. He looked over his shoulder, then lowered his voice to a near inaudible level. "You shouldn't be asking about that," he said, almost pleading. "Some things are better left forgotten." He looked down at his hands as if ashamed. Then he glanced up, his eyes filled with fear. "Trust me, you don't." I was growing more frustrated with each passing conversation. No one seemed willing to tell me anything, and the more they reacted like this, the more I felt compelled to dig deeper. But the village was full of closed mouths and fearful eyes. It wasn't until I found the old man that I finally got a glimpse of the truth. He was sitting by the fire outside his small, weathered house, his back hunched with age. I had passed him a few times on my walks through the village, always too busy to stop. But today, there was something about him that made me pause. It wasn't just his age or the way he sat in silence as though waiting for something. It was the way his eyes seemed to look straight through you, as if he had seen things no one else had. I approached him slowly, unsure of how to start the conversation. But when I mentioned the woods, he turned his gaze to me, his eyes narrowing, and he motioned for me to sit down beside him. His voice, when he spoke, was rough, like it hadn't been used much in recent years, and his words came out in a hushed, almost reverent tone. "A long time ago," he began, his voice filled with a deep sorrow, "there was a ritual to summon something ancient, something so powerful that it could change the world. They thought they were calling upon a force that could bring them everything they desired: immortality, power, wealth. They were foolish." He paused, his hands trembling as he adjusted the firewood in front of him. I leaned in, captivated by his words, but the air around us felt charged, thick with something unspeakable. They were a group of men and women, old families from the village, devoted to the occult, to the ancient ways. They believed the ritual would unlock the greatest of powers, but they didn't know what they were dealing with. No one could have known. When they performed it, they called something into this world, something that shouldn't have been called. The old man's voice faltered for a moment, as though he was reliving something painful. Something went wrong. The ritual, it didn't work as they expected. Instead of gaining power, they unleashed a curse, a force that no one could control. The earth trembled, the skies darkened, and the very trees in the woods seemed to scream. The curse was unleashed upon them, and it followed them. It followed them all. I felt a cold chill creep up my spine, and I instinctively leaned closer, eager to hear more, even though a part of me already wished I hadn't asked. The old man glanced over his shoulder as if checking that no one was listening before continuing. They didn't know how to stop it. The curse consumed them, turned them into shadows, twisted things that haunt these woods to this day. And after it was done with them, it turned its attention to the village. The crops withered. The animals died. People started disappearing. Anyone who dared to speak of it, well, you know what happened to them. He looked at me then, his eyes sharp despite his age, as if he could see right through me. No one dares to speak of it anymore. You should be careful. There are things that should stay buried. You don't want to know what's out there. Trust me. Whatever they summoned, it never left, and it never will. I sat there for a long time, the weight of his words sinking in. The fire crackled softly, but the warmth from it didn't seem to reach me. The air felt colder, heavier, and I couldn't help but wonder, was this just the ramblings of an old man, or was there truth in his tale? As I stood up to leave, he grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail. His eyes locked onto mine, and his voice was barely a whisper. Don't go looking for it. Some things should stay buried. Some things should never be unearthed. His words echoed in my mind as I walked away. But it wasn't the warning that haunted me. It was the look in his eyes, the fear, the helplessness, as if he knew that the curse was still there, still waiting, and that I had already crossed a line. I wasn't sure what I had just learned, but one thing was certain. The deeper I dug, the closer I got to something that I might not be able to escape. As I walked through the village, the weight of the old man's words hung heavily on my mind. Some things should stay buried, but the more I thought about it, the more the story consumed me. There was something about it, something that kept me up at night. The whispers, the shadow, the curse. It all seemed too real to be mere folklore. I knew that I had to learn more, to uncover the truth buried deep within the history of this village, and so I set out to dig deeper. The library was small, hidden behind rows of old stone buildings. It was the kind of place that seemed lost in time, as if it had not changed in centuries. Dust clung to the shelves, and the musty smell of old books filled the air. I wandered through the aisles, looking for something that could give me answers. I was about to give up when a peculiar shelf caught my eye, one that seemed different from the others. It wasn't in the usual order, and the books there seemed older, more worn. Among them, an old leather-bound journal lay half-hidden, its edges yellowed with age. I carefully pulled it out and opened the first page. The handwriting was uneven, as though it had been written in a hurry, or perhaps in fear. As I read the words, a chill crept down my spine. The journal spoke of a secret cult, a group of people whose names were lost to history, but whose actions would haunt the village for centuries to come. They were drawn to the woods, seeking to unlock powers far beyond the grasp of ordinary mortals. The cult, as the journal described, believed in ancient rituals passed down through generations, and they thought that by performing one such ritual, they could tap into a force that would grant them unimaginable strength. The ritual was to take place in the heart of the woods, where the veil between the physical world and the spiritual realm was said to be thinnest. They believed that by making a pact, they could summon an ancient entity, something older than time itself. This being would grant them everything they desired: immortality, power, wealth, and control over all things. The cult believed they had discovered the perfect alignment of the stars and forces of nature, and they were certain that this ritual would work. As I read further, my fingers trembling, the journal described in haunting detail the night of the ritual. The cult members gathered in the clearing deep in the woods, chanting ancient incantations that had not been spoken for generations. The earth trembled beneath their feet as they began the ceremony, each one of them offering something of great value: a cherished possession, a memory, or in some cases, their own blood. The air was thick with power, the energy palpable, crackling around them like static. But something went horribly wrong. The journal's author, whose identity remained a mystery, wrote of the moment when the ritual turned dark. The sky above them had shifted from the peaceful glow of the moon to something far darker. The air grew thick with an unnatural heaviness, and the stars seemed to dim as the forces they had hoped to control
spiraled out of their grasp. The incantations, meant to summon the ancient being, took on a life of their own, twisting and distorting in the air. Instead of the creature they had hoped to bring forth, something far worse emerged. A dark force, an ancient shadow that had been lying dormant, waiting for the moment of its release. This shadow was not bound by the same rules as the living. It was ancient, beyond comprehension, and far more dangerous than they could have imagined. In their desperation, the cult members tried to reverse the ritual, to undo the pact they had so eagerly made. But it was too late. The shadow that had been summoned was not a creature that could be dismissed with a simple spell. No, it was a force, a curse that now had a hold on the land itself. The shadow moved through the woods, feeding off the fear and the souls of those who had participated in the ritual. The souls of the cult members were trapped, bound to the land by the curse they had unleashed. The village, which had once thrived, was never the same after that night. The crops began to fail, the animals started to die, and the people who lived there started to disappear one by one. Those who remained, those who had not taken part in the ritual, spoke in hushed whispers of the dark forces that had taken root in the land. They spoke of the shadows that moved between the trees, of the voices. I continued to read, the story unfolding like a nightmare that had never ended. The journal spoke of the cult's leader, a man who had seemed so sure of his control over the dark forces. But even he could not escape the curse. His soul, like the others, was trapped in the woods, bound to the land, forever searching for release. His last words were written down in the journal, a final plea for forgiveness and redemption. But the author of the journal, who seemed to have survived, knew better. The curse was not something that could be forgiven. It was not something that could be undone. The journal's final pages spoke of the ritual's aftermath, how the cult members, now mere shadows of their former selves, continued to haunt the woods. The whispers that could be heard on the wind were not just the rustling of leaves. They were the voices of the souls trapped in the woods, calling out for release, for redemption, for peace. But they would never find it, not as long as the curse remained. As I closed the journal, a sense of dread washed over me. The woods, the whispers, the shadow, it was all real. The curse that had been unleashed that fateful night had never gone away. It lingered, trapped in the land, waiting for someone to come along and stumble upon it. And now it seemed that someone was me. The question now was, what was I going to do with this knowledge? The village had tried to forget. The villagers had sealed their lips, unwilling to speak of the curse. But I had seen the truth. I had read the words, and now I was caught in the web of the past. The shadow, the curse, was still out there. It hadn't been defeated. It hadn't been contained. And it was waiting. The journal had warned me. The old man had warned me. But now, it was too late. The story had already begun to unfold, and there was no turning back. The curse was not something that could be avoided. It was something that would follow me, just as it had followed everyone else before me. And no matter how hard I tried to escape, the shadows would always be there, waiting. The longer I stayed in the village, the more unsettling things became. What had once seemed like an innocent and peaceful place slowly transformed into something far more sinister. At first, it was just small things I could easily dismiss as coincidences, or my imagination running wild. But as the days wore on, those small, strange occurrences began to add up, and the air itself seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour, thick with an invisible presence that hung over the village like a storm waiting to break. The first sign came one morning when I was walking through the village square. It was still early, the sun barely breaking over the horizon, casting a pale light over the cobblestones. People were starting their day, but there was an unease in the air that I couldn't shake. As I passed a row of houses, I noticed something strange. There were shadows moving at the edges of the homes, shifting in ways that didn't make sense. I stopped, trying to make sense of it. But the moment I turned my head to look more closely, the shadows disappeared, vanishing as if they had never been there at all. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a trick of the light. But as I continued walking, I saw the same thing happen in another part of the village. The shadows would flicker at the corners of houses, just out of sight, like something or someone was lurking just beyond the edge of the light. It wasn't until I spoke to an old woman later that day that I realized I wasn't the only one who had seen it. "You saw them, didn't you?" she asked in a voice that was barely above a whisper, as if she didn't want anyone else to hear. Her face was lined with years of worry, her eyes dull with fear. "Shadows," she continued, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "They've been here for as long as I can remember. Not just the ones outside, but inside too. People hear them in the middle of the night. You don't see them, but you know they're there." At first, I thought she was just another villager, caught up in the fear of the curse. But then the strange things began to happen more frequently. It started with the doors. At night, I would hear the creak of old wood, the sound of doors opening and closing when no one was around. It would happen when the moon was high, and I would lie awake in my bed, wondering if I was imagining it. But when I got up to check, there was no one there, and no explanation for what I had heard. One night, I decided to investigate. I slipped quietly out of my room and moved through the village, following the sound of creaking doors. The air was thick with that same heavy, oppressive feeling, and the moonlight seemed dimmer, as though something was blocking its glow. I walked past the homes, listening, until I heard the unmistakable sound of a door opening. I rushed toward the sound, my heart pounding in my chest, and I saw it. The door of an old farmhouse creaking open slowly, as if being pushed by an unseen hand. No one was inside, and the house was dark. I stepped closer, cautiously, but before I could get too close, the door slammed shut with a force that made the ground beneath me shake. I jumped back, my breath coming in sharp gasps, and I stood frozen for a moment, my mind racing. What was causing this? Who or what was responsible for these strange occurrences? I wasn't the only one feeling it. Over the next few days, the villagers spoke in hushed tones about the things that had been happening. Crops that had once flourished began to wither for no apparent reason. Fields of wheat turned brown, their once healthy stalks shriveled and dead. Farmers complained that no matter how much they watered their crops, nothing seemed to help. The soil itself seemed to reject them, as though the land had turned against them. And it wasn't just the crops. Livestock began to disappear without a trace. One by one, cows, chickens, and goats were found missing, their pens empty, their gates untouched. At first, people assumed they had been stolen, but there were no signs of forced entry, no footprints, no broken fences, nothing that could explain their disappearance. Some claimed they heard strange noises during the night, soft cries, or the sound of hooves running through the fields. But when they went out to investigate, there was no trace of the animals, only a lingering sense of dread in the air. It wasn't long before the villagers began to speak in hushed tones about the curse again. Some claimed that the shadow from the ritual had come to claim what was owed to it. Others whispered that the souls of the cult members, trapped in the woods for centuries, had returned, seeking revenge for the pact they had made so long ago. Whatever the cause, one thing was certain. The curse was not just a story. It was alive, and it was reaching out to claim the village. One night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, the sound of footsteps outside my window broke the silence. It was late, too late for anyone to be out in the village, and the air had grown uncomfortably cold. I lay still, my heart hammering in my chest, straining to listen. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there was moving with purpose. The sound of the steps grew louder,
closer, until they were right outside my window. I froze, my body tense. I slowly reached for the window, trying to peek out. But when I looked outside, there was no one there. The darkness was thick, and the moonlight barely pierced through the clouds. Yet the footsteps continued, as if they were coming from somewhere deep within the woods, echoing through the village, drawing closer with each passing second. I opened the window slowly, my hands trembling, and the chill in the air hit me like a slap to the face. It was freezing, colder than it had been all night. I looked out into the dark void, but there was nothing. Just the wind, rustling the leaves and bending the branches. I pulled the window shut, my mind racing. There was no logical explanation for what I had heard. No one could have been outside. There were no footsteps on the ground, no tracks, no sign of anyone being near. The curse, the shadow, whatever it was alive and well. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just some ancient story. The curse had never left. It was real, and it was slowly consuming the village, piece by piece. As the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The village, once so familiar, now felt foreign and suffocating. The air grew heavier, the whispers louder, and I knew in my gut that I was being drawn deeper into something far darker than I had ever imagined. The signs were everywhere, and they weren't just coincidences anymore. The curse was not just a part of the village's past. It was the village's present, and it was coming for me. I could no longer deny it. The signs, the strange occurrences, and the overwhelming feeling that something was terribly wrong. It was all leading me to one conclusion. The journal, the warnings, the whispers in the village, they were all pointing toward one place, one moment in time that I could no longer ignore. The truth was out there, buried deep in the woods, and I was going to find it, no matter the cost. The journal had described an ancient altar, a place where the ritual had been performed so many years ago. According to the faded pages, the altar was hidden deep in the heart of the forest, in a clearing, surrounded by trees that had stood there for centuries. The cult had gathered there, performing their dark incantations to summon an entity from beyond the veil. It was there, at that very spot, that they had made their pact, and it was there that the curse had been unleashed. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the atmosphere grew thicker. The trees seemed to press in on me, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, blocking out the sunlight and casting everything in a dim, oppressive gloom. The path was barely visible, and I had to push my way through dense underbrush, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air was cold, biting at my skin, and the silence around me was unnerving. It was the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched, like you're not alone, even though you can't see a soul.
The deeper I went, the stronger the feeling became. I could feel the weight of the history that hung in the air, the remnants of the dark ritual that had taken place so long ago. It was as if the very land itself had been marked by the event, as if the earth remembered what had been done and was still suffering from it. The closer I got to the altar, the more I could feel the pulse of the curse. A steady, rhythmic thrum beneath my feet, like a heartbeat coming from the ground itself. Finally, after what felt like hours of walking, I found it. The clearing opened up before me, and there, in the center, was the altar. It was ancient, made of weathered stone and covered in moss and vines. The air around it felt thick, almost oppressive, as if the stones themselves were holding something back. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest, and examined the altar more closely. It was covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the stone. They were unlike anything I had ever seen before. Intricate, twisting designs that seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I knelt down beside the altar, running my fingers over the markings, trying to make sense of them. The symbols felt cold, almost as if they were alive, as if they were waiting for something to happen. I could feel the weight of the power that had been summoned here so long ago, and I knew, without a doubt, that whatever had been unleashed on that night still lingered in the air, still clung to this place. As I studied the altar, trying to decipher the inscriptions, I heard it, the whispering. It was faint at first, like a distant murmur carried on the wind. But then it grew louder, clearer, as though it was coming from all around me. The sound seemed to echo through the trees, reverberating off the stone, as if the very ground itself was speaking. The whispers were unintelligible, fragmented, but they felt wrong. They were filled with malice, with an anger that had been buried for centuries, and they filled me with a deep, primal fear. I stood up, my pulse quickening, and looked around, but there was nothing to see. The clearing was empty, save for the altar and the trees. Yet the whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent. I felt a sudden chill run down my spine, and I instinctively backed away from the altar. It was as if the very earth beneath me was alive, stirring with the power of the curse that had been awakened. And then, without warning, the ground began to tremble. At first, it was just a slight vibration, a gentle quaking that could have been attributed to the wind or the shifting of the earth. But it quickly escalated, and soon the ground was shaking violently beneath my feet. The trees around the clearing creaked and groaned, their trunks swaying unnaturally, as if something deep within the earth was stirring. Awakening, the air became thick with an energy I couldn't explain, and the whispers grew louder. now unmistakably a chorus of voices, all chanting in unison. I could feel the ground shifting beneath me, and I stumbled backward, my heart racing in my chest. It was as if the earth itself was alive, as though something ancient and powerful had been awakened, and it was reaching out, pulling at me. I tried to move, but my legs felt heavy, as if the ground was pulling me down, trying to trap me in place. And then I saw it. At first, it was nothing more than a flicker, a shadow moving in the corner of my eye. But as I turned toward it, I saw it more clearly, a dark, twisting shape emerging from the ground itself, like a living nightmare taking form before my eyes. It moved slowly at first, its form shifting and changing, stretching and contorting in ways that defied logic, as if it was made of pure darkness. It was not a creature in the traditional sense. It was more like an embodiment of the very curse that had been unleashed here so many years ago. It was a shadow, but not like any shadow I had ever seen. It seemed to pull at the edges of reality itself, distorting the air around it, bending light in unnatural ways. I couldn't breathe. My body was frozen in place, as if the very sight of the thing before me had paralyzed me. The shadow moved toward me, its form rippling like liquid, stretching and twisting in ways that defied all understanding. Its presence was suffocating, like it was draining the very air around me. I could feel its coldness, an icy chill that seemed to seep into my bones. The whispers grew louder. Now a cacophony of voices, all crying out in a language I couldn't understand. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to move, to run. But my legs wouldn't obey. I was trapped, caught in the grip of something far beyond my comprehension. The shadow loomed closer, its dark tendrils reaching out toward me, pulling at the very fabric of reality. I could feel its presence, pressing in on me from all sides, suffocating me with its malevolent force. It was as if it was feeding off my fear, growing stronger with every breath I took. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the sight. But the feeling of its presence only grew stronger. I could feel it now, not just in the air, but in my very soul, pulling at something deep within me. The ground trembled beneath me, and I could hear the whispers again, louder now, their voices filled with rage and hunger. The curse was alive, and it was coming for me. Just as I thought I couldn't take it any longer, I felt a sudden force push me backward, sending me crashing to the ground. I gasped for air, my body trembling uncontrollably. The shadow had retreated, vanishing back into the earth as quickly as it had appeared. The ground stopped shaking, and the air grew still once again. But the whispers remained, faint but constant, lingering in the corners of my mind. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, too terrible. The night was thick, with an unnatural stillness, a weight pressing down on the very air around me. The forest seemed alive with an eerie energy, as though every tree, every stone, every breath of wind was holding its collective breath. And there I stood, alone, facing the altar, the very site of the cursed ritual that had begun it all. It was as if the earth itself had been waiting for this moment, waiting for someone to complete what had been left unfinished. The shadows of the trees stretched long in the moonlight, twisting and turning like living creatures, their movements slow and deliberate, following my every step. I could feel their eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. The whispers had grown louder, a cacophony in my ears, mingling with the soft rustling of the leaves and the distant howls of unseen animals. The curse, the very thing that had gripped this land for centuries, was waiting for me to fulfill what the cult had failed to do all those years ago. I had come to the realization that the curse could only be broken if I finished what they had started, that I had to complete the ritual. The journal had made it clear, to break the curse, I had to offer something of my own. But this was no simple sacrifice. It wasn't just a physical offering. It was my soul. The same way the cult members had given their souls to the dark forces they had summoned, I had to do the same in order to set the trapped souls free. It was the only way. I felt the pull deep in my chest as I approached the altar. The air around me grew colder, the very ground beneath my feet vibrating with a power that I couldn't comprehend. The altar, with its ancient symbols etched into the stone, seemed to hum with energy. It was as if it was alive, waiting for me to make my choice. The weight of the decision pressed down on me like an invisible force. What was I willing to sacrifice? What was I willing to lose in order to stop the curse and set the trapped souls free? A shadow, this entity that had been awakened, moved slowly toward me, its form twisting and rippling in the darkness. It was no longer just a formless mass of darkness. No, now it had a shape, a form that was terrifyingly humanoid, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of reality. It moved toward me, its eyes locked onto mine, and I could feel it drawing me in, pulling at my very soul. I could hear its whispers, low and insistent, beckoning me to give in, to surrender to the darkness. As I stood there, frozen in place, I felt a deep, primal fear rise within me. I knew what the shadow wanted. It wanted me to give up. It wanted me to surrender my soul, to complete the pact that the cult had made all those years ago. The shadow's form seemed to grow larger, its presence more overwhelming with every passing second. It was no longer just a thing of darkness. It was a force, a presence that filled the air and threatened to consume me entirely. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I was so close to giving in, so close to offering my soul in exchange for the freedom of the others. The curse would finally be broken. The souls would be freed, and I could walk away from this nightmare. But then, something shifted in my mind. I remembered the old man's warning. His voice echoed in my head, clear as day. Some things should stay buried. The words struck me like a lightning bolt, and it hit me all at once. This wasn't a choice I should be making. This wasn't about breaking the curse. This was a trap. The shadow, the curse, everything that had happened since I first set foot in this village. It had all been leading me here, to this moment, to this altar. It wasn't a ritual that would free anyone. It was a trap designed to claim my soul, just as it had claimed the souls of the cult members long before me. In that moment of realization, something inside me snapped. I couldn't do it. I couldn't offer my soul. I had to break free. I had to escape. The shadow was close now, its eyes glowing with hunger, its form so close I could feel its cold, suffocating presence. I could hear it whispering, urging me to give in, to surrender. The air around me seemed to warp and twist, pulling at my very being. But I couldn't give up. I couldn't let the curse take me. I turned and ran. I don't even know how I found the strength to move. My legs were shaking, my heart racing in my chest. But I ran. I didn't stop, didn't look back. The shadow was behind me, following, its whispers growing louder with every step. It wanted me. It wanted my soul, and it would stop at nothing to claim it. I didn't know if I could escape. The woods seemed to close in around me, the trees reaching out like grasping hands. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, pulling at my feet, trying to keep me from running. But I pushed forward, my breath ragged, my body burning with the effort. The shadow was still behind me, following relentlessly, its cold presence pressing in on me from all sides. I could feel its power, its pull, like an invisible force wrapping around me, dragging me back to the altar. I stumbled, my foot catching on a root, and I fell to the ground, my palms scraping against the cold earth. I gasped for air, panic rising in my chest. The shadow was so close now, I could feel its breath on the back of my neck. It was only a matter of time before it caught me, before it dragged me back into the darkness. But then I remembered something else, the villagers' warnings, the tales they told of the curse. The shadow may have been powerful, but it wasn't invincible. There was a way to defeat it, to stop it from claiming me, to stop it from feeding on my soul. The journal had mentioned it in a cryptic way, something about the land itself, about how the curse could only survive as long as the pact remained unbroken. It wasn't just about my soul. It was about the land, the ritual, the balance of power. The shadow could only exist as long as the ritual was incomplete, as long as it was feeding on the souls trapped by the curse. I had to break the cycle. I had to break the ritual itself. I pushed myself up, my body screaming in pain, and I made a desperate choice. The shadow might be able to claim my soul, but it wouldn't be able to claim the land. Not if I could stop it. I turned and made my way back toward the altar, the shadow still following, still whispering my name. I could hear its voice growing louder, its presence pressing in on me. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I reached the altar, and with trembling hands, I pressed my palm against the cold stone. The moment I did, the ground trembled beneath me once more, and the air grew thick with power. The shadow stopped, its form flickering as if confused, uncertain. I didn't know if it would work, but I didn't have time to think. I closed my eyes, focusing all my energy, and I whispered the words from the journal. The incantation meant to reverse the ritual, to break the pact. The shadow screamed in fury, its form writhing as if in pain. But it was too late. The curse, the ritual, everything that had been built on lies and suffering began to unravel. The shadow's form collapsed into itself, its power fading as the land began to heal. The whispers quieted, the grip of the curse loosening. I fell to my knees, exhausted, but free. The shadow was gone. The curse was broken. But as I sat there, trembling and breathing heavily, I realized something else. The village would never be the same. The land, the people, everything was changed, and the shadow might have left, but the price of its departure had been high. I wasn't sure if I had truly escaped it. The curse might have been broken, but its mark, its presence, would linger forever. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how much I tried to forget, I knew that the shadow would always be with me. It would never truly let me go.